In the past couple months, I've read all of this book, and a few chapters of this book, and all of these lectures on YouTube, and I've realized that the American political system is pretty clearly descended from the English political system, and you can kind of see how one flows into the other. You can see how different political factions have always been merging and splitting and changing who's allied with who, and in a really roundabout way, you can see how competing factions in the court of King Henry VIII eventually became today's Democrats and Republicans. You could probably trace it back even further if you wanted to, but these lectures start with King Henry VIII, so that's where I'm gonna start. Henry VIII didn't found the Church of England just so he could divorce his wife. That was a big part of it, but he probably saw himself as something of a moderate church reformer. Like, he wanted to clean up corruption in the church without going all-out Protestant. Unfortunately, this made basically nobody happy. Society was divided between people who were disgusted with how the Church of England was still ritualistically and dogmatically Catholic, and people who were disgusted with how it had ever broken off from the Pope in the first place. So basically, closet Lutherans and closet Catholics. Power swung back and forth between the two for a while before Elizabeth I took over. She had a very long, relatively peaceful reign, during which things calmed down a bit, and most people actually kind of got on board with the idea of the Church of England. During an era when Protestants and Catholics were tearing each other apart in Europe, the Church of England seemed like a sort of moderate compromise between the two. People who thought that way dominated politics for a while, and for a while, there was a fair amount of consensus on most major issues, but when Charles I came to the throne, things got divisive again. He and Parliament started fighting each other more and more over which of them had the right to do things like levy taxes, or declare war, or regulate the church. People started picking sides between the two until eventually it broke out into the English Civil War. I'm mostly gonna skip over that very turbulent period, but suffice it to say that it involved rebellions in Scotland and Ireland, and a brief Puritan theocracy under Oliver Cromwell, and at one point they chopped off the king's head. But when it all settled down again, things kind of went back to how they were before. Once again, there was a parliament and a king, and once again, they were uneasily sharing power. The main difference was that now there was an understanding that Parliament was entitled to at least an equal share of power with the king, and if the king didn't respect that balance of power, it probably wouldn't end well for him. But there was still a lot of disagreement about which one should get how much power, and around this time, supporters of the king started calling themselves Tories, while supporters of Parliament started calling themselves Whigs. Over time, the Whigs became more and more popular, and the Tories became less and less popular, and this was especially true in the English colonies in the Americas. There were a few Tory sympathizers, but for the most part, society was dominated by people who identified themselves with the Whigs. Society was somewhat divided, however, between two groups who I'm going to call the Populists and the Conservatives. There was a broad consensus at the time that there should be a sort of balance of power between the rich landed aristocracy on one hand and the everyday farmer on the other, but exactly how much power each should get was a source of most early political disagreements. Unsurprisingly, when the Revolution came, the Loyalists mostly drew their support from the Conservatives. But not all Conservatives became Loyalists. Many of them, maybe most of them, joined the Revolution, and then, after the Revolution, became the Federalist Party, while those who were populist in the early colonial days mostly became the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans differed on a lot, but a lot of it came down to the fact that the Federalists had a fundamentally elitist attitude. They very openly wanted the rich elite of society to have a disproportionately large say in politics, and they wanted a strong federal government to help preserve the power of the landed aristocracy. Unsurprisingly, the Federalists dwindled more and more as time went on, losing 6 presidential elections in a row. It's honestly kind of surprising to me that they won any elections to begin with. Things got interesting again when Andrew Jackson won the presidency. He was an incredibly divisive person, and the Democratic Republicans split into the Democrats who supported him and the Whigs who opposed him. Eventually, the two parties sort of solidified along economic lines, with the Whigs supporting a national bank and high tariffs to fund stuff like railroads, and the Democrats supporting low tariffs and not a national bank. More fundamentally, the Democrats were kind of the party of the poor, or at the very least, the party of people who were wary of the industrial capitalism that was starting to emerge, while the Whigs embraced it and tried to help it along. Then, from 1846 to 1847, the war with Mexico happened, and the issue came up of whether or not to allow slavery in the territory we had just taken, and that opened up the whole issue of slavery in general, which until this point, people had mostly been trying to avoid. Basically everyone in the North was anti-slavery, although they differed on exactly how anti-slavery they were, while basically everyone in the South, besides the slaves, were very pro-slavery. Since there were both Democrats and Whigs in both the North and the South, this wound up splitting both parties. Even though slavery was becoming the all-encompassing political issue, the Whig Party refused to take a stance on it until the bitter end, with the result that the Southern Whigs left to join the Democratic Party, while the Northern Whigs went off and made a whole new party meant specifically to oppose slavery, the Republican Party. And that's how we wound up with the Democrats and Republicans. There's been plenty of interesting stuff since then. The two parties have always been very loose coalitions of regions and demographics and ideologies, colonies. And the story of how we went from this to this is fascinating, but I'm still trying to figure out large parts of that story for myself, so we can talk about it some other time.